Hello everyone, welcome back to our lecture today. Our lecture today is going to cover populations, kind of what a population is, some of the things that influence populations, kind of how scientists study populations, and a couple of other things like that. So let's go ahead and get started with that. So first things first, we're going to talk about ecology. Ecology is kind of the broader scope of science in general that studies the living and non-living environments around us and how they interact with one another. So you can break ecology down into a bunch of different levels. First off, someone who studies ecology is an ecologist. You'll have an organismal ecologist, population ecologist, community ecologist, things like that. So let's talk about the different levels of ecology. So the first one is an organismal ecologist. So an organism is me for all intents and purposes, looking at one particular individual of a species. Now that's useful if you want to know everything about me. Now, studying me is going to tell you a lot about the overall anatomy of humans in general and things like that. But overall, it's not going to be that helpful if you're trying to figure out the populations of humans and reproductive trends or life cycles and lifespans and things like that, because I'm just one human. I don't represent the average, if you like. Studying one thing is useful, but not particularly helpful. Now, a population, what we're going to talk about today, population ecologists, those are the most common. Evolution works at the population level, and that's why most people study it. Population is going to be something like all the humans in Nashville, if you like. All the different individuals of the same species that occupy the same area. They can all interbreed with one another. They can all compete for the same resources and things like that. So all those organisms are going to compete with one another. Now, humans over in Russia, now granted, we do have global trade and things like that today, but 2,000 years ago, they're probably not going to influence us very much. So that's basically how that works. You're kind of stuck in your little local environment. And animals in particular, unless you can fly, are a little more geographically isolated. Now, community is going to be all of the living organisms, all of the different populations of living organisms in, say, Nashville or something like that, a defined area. All the different species of birds, all their populations, all the different species of reptiles, fish, plants, things like that, bugs, all those different species of animals and things and plants interact with one another, predator prey, food, things like that, produce food, either are eaten as food, and things like that. So, basically, all the living organisms, the food web, if you like, are all interconnected. So communities of organisms are all in the same area. Once again, trees in Russia really aren't going to influence the trees or the rabbits here, if you like. So kind of makes sense on that one. Now, an ecosystem, one up, is all of the non-living and living things now, throwing in the non-living, which makes sense if you think about things like rain or wind or sun. Or drought, stuff like that, fire, all the non-living things that influence that particular area. Is it prone to droughts? Does it have a lot of rain and stuff like that? Organisms that live in that ecosystem are all going to be influenced by the communities that are around them, as well as the ecosystems, the rain and stuff like that that's around them as well. So if we take all the different ecosystems on the planet, we put them all together, we get the planet, aka the biosphere. All the different ecosystems that are connected. If there's a massive wildfire that burns the savanna, that soot is going to go into the ash is going to go into the atmosphere and then be pushed around the globe. Same with like volcanic eruptions and stuff like that. So it makes sense if you think about it. They are all interconnected and they all influence one another. So we're going to talk about populations, how populations work, a couple other things that influence populations. So like I mentioned, population is a group of all the same species of one organism or that are found in a particular isolated area, defined area. So if you look at these two examples, we have penguins and palm trees. Now our penguins here, there's a whole bunch of them. Now those penguins have something now, as an ecologist would refer to, as something called high population density. Now this makes sense if you think about it. There's a lot of penguins in that little area. Now if you look at the palm trees on the other hand, they have a very low population density. There's a couple of them in one little area, and the other ones are on the other hill over there. You can see that. Now, If you have a high population density, that could be a good thing, but it also could be a bad thing. You have really easy access to mates. You're going to have safety in numbers and things like that. But you're also going to have to worry about competition for resources. You're going to have to worry about competition for just space in general. Same with our trees over here. They have low population density, which means they don't have to worry about fighting for resources. They're going to have to worry about sharing with the two or three around them, but overall, not so much. But on the other hand, there's not a lot for reproductive choices because there's two or three around and they're probably all related. If your population dies and the little one across the hill you can't get to, you're all going to die, basically, how that works. So population density has benefits and trade-offs if it's high or low, and it's regulated by natural cycles. If there's too many organisms, they will get rid of their resources and they'll start to die off. Or if there's just enough resources, just enough animals or plants or whatever will be able to survive, to thrive in that particular environment, like our palm trees here. Just 4 or 5 of them can survive, 6 or 7 of them, they'd all die, and that's basically what would happen. So you get just the minimum amount that you can have to grow there. So population density changes over time as things move in and out, predator-prey relationships, natural cycles of the moving in and out migrations, things like that. So habitat shifts, things like that, moving around of animals, habitat shifts being things like, the Arctic melting or so the desert becoming too green or something like that, or desertification where something that was green becomes a desert. Those particular things can have massive impacts on populations of animals because if they're evolved to live in this particular area, they're going to have to move. And then if they find a new area, it might be bigger, which is awesome, or it might be smaller. There might be more or less resources and things like that. So shifting habitats can really influence populations of animals. So how do we study populations of animals and how do we figure these things out? Basically, there's lots of different ways in there. Some of them are really easy, some of them aren't. You can fly over and look at them. In the case of our penguins, you can see how they're spaced out, and if you really want to, you could take a really nice picture and count every single one of their little colonies and figure out how many of them there are. The palm tree is the same kind of thing. You can count the little clusters of them. It's pretty easy on that one. You can sample a small subset. So people do this one a lot if you're studying large population, things like fish. So what they'll do is they'll take a spawning fish population that's got billions of eggs in it, and somebody will capture, maybe 1,000 or 10,000 of the little larvae or something, and they'll mark them with a little tag or some luminescent dye or something like that. And then they'll let them back out in the ocean. And then 5-10 years later or whatever, they'll come back and they'll catch them again, and do see what they come back and things like that. That's mark recapture. That's also sampling a small subset. Marking recapture allows you to see if animals survive over how long they survive, what's the overall survivability, if a lot of them die or if a lot of them come back, do they move around the world, where do they go, how often they die when they reproduce, things like that. That's a very useful information for marker recapture. Sampling a small subset means you're going to go catch a couple of them, study them, or study a small population to kind of get an idea of what would be going on with the community, the populations overall as a trend kind of thing. So why do we care? It really does matter. If there's too many particular animals, predators in an area or prey in an area, that can be a bad thing. Too many prey, the predators are going to explode. Too many predators, the prey are going to decline. So if things like hunting and things, when it comes to populations of deer, that controls how many population size influences how many hunting licenses we issue. And things like that, because if we have too many males or too many females, the deer population can get too large and things like that. And then disease is prone to hit them, and then they deplete their resources and stuff like that. And another big deal is controlling ecological pests. So things like bugs and stuff like that can come in and kill the food, plants and things, and sometimes maybe the organisms themselves that we're more concerned with. Things like koalas and stuff like that are influenced by that kind of thing in Australia. Now, if populations grow, that makes perfect sense. We're going to see more organisms go into that population than organisms that leave. If it remains stable, basically the same organisms that are dying are going to be replaced by organisms that are going to be born. There's really not going to be a lot of growth in it. And if a population starts to shrink, not a lot of organisms are going to be born. A lot more are going to be dying off, and that population as a whole is going to start declining. And eventually, if that trend doesn't change, that population will go extinct. Now, why does that matter? Birth rates and death rates and stuff can really influence the growth rates of populations. If you have a lot of births, a very high birth rate, you're going to have a very high rate of population growth. If you have a very high death rate, you are going to have a very high decline of your population. Your population is not going to last very long. So both of those things have to be balanced out. If you have a very high birth rate and a very low death rate, your population is going to grow exponentially. If you have a very low birth rate and a very high death rate, your population is going to go extinct very quickly. So lots of different things can influence births and deaths, and a lot of them make sense. You can check them out on this little chart here if you want to. A lot of them are just common sense. How long we live, accidents, things like that. Populations with a lot of young organisms are going to grow and reproduce very, very quickly. That also makes sense if you think about it, because those young organisms are fit, they're healthy, they're metabolically active, they're going to be competing for resources, they're going to be in their reproductive ages, their reproductive primes. So those organisms are going to be reproducing, making lots of babies, which will eventually reproduce, which make lots more babies, and that population is going to grow. Now, if you have a population that's mainly older, the opposite's going to happen. Those older organisms, they're kind of past their reproductive prime. They're still going to be consuming resources that the younger generation would have to compete for. While instead of putting things back to replenish themselves, like babies and stuff like that, they're just going to be taking resources out of the environment. So the younger generation of organisms is going to have to struggle a little more to achieve maturity, to achieve sexual reproductive rates and things like that, maturity, to be able to replace themselves in the populations from the death rate. So populations with really high elder populations tend to decline over time because they're not being replaced, whereas really high young populations are going to be growing very quickly. Now, lots of things can influence this. If a forest fire comes in and it burns off all the mature trees, and the babies are the only ones that can the seeds are underneath the ground, and then they come back, you have a very young population. Whereas the other thing comes around, somebody comes in and plows the ground, and they plow around all the big trees, whereas all the seeds are destroyed in the ground, and just the big trees are there. And that happens every year for 50, 60 years. The same thing is going to happen. You're not going to have a lot of young trees in that field or that forest or whatever. And lots of different things can influence this. And this is not just limited to plants. This idea can be spread around to lots of different organisms. And most organisms on the planet are influenced by this. Ecologists and scientists, biologists overall that study animals have come up with something called a life probability table to kind of predict the likelihood of an organism reaching a particular age. So basically what we do with this is we catch a whole bunch of animals, or we find a bunch of dead ones and things like that, and we figure out how old they are when they die. First we have to know how old they live in the first place. What's their terminal lifespan? How long can a particular species, in this case a penguin, live? So if a penguin can live at the maximum 20 years, what's the likelihood of a penguin reaching it to 20? So at the beginning, we have all of them hatch, and all of the 1,000 penguins that we're going to study are alive. Now, in a year, we come back and we look, and we find that vast majority of them died. And that happens in most animal species. There's 70 to 80% die-off in the vast majority of animals on the planet. It's kind of sad. As the years continue, you have to think about it. A lot of organisms, they don't know how to survive when they're just kicked out into the world. A lot of predators can get on young organisms. It's hard to feed them. Can't protect themselves. So first years of life are very difficult. And then once they get past that, they kind of figure it out. So if you make it past your first year, you're kind of more likely to survive to kind of the end of your lifespan. It's kind of how that works. So, um, what's going to happen is you look at those animals over time and you follow them until they all die. And then if the terminal lifespan is 20, how often or how many of them make it to 20? And then you can come up with probabilities and predictions of this particular penguin or this particular species, if you like, has a 15% probability of making it to age to age 13. Um, so you can predict based on that if you have a really high or really low population density or really high population of elder or young and things like that, what the population is going to look like over a particular number of years. So it's actually really useful information and actually kind of cool. So lots of other things influence how populations grow. And mainly what these are how organisms influence and invest their time to care for their babies. And this makes sense if you think about it. A population that's, of organisms or an organism that's classified as a type 1 species is going to live, for the most part, a very long time. But with that lifespan, of a long lifespan, comes a lot of investment in babies. Now, if you have a baby that takes, in our case, 18 years or to become an adult, you're probably not going to want to have 40 of them in that time span. You're going to want to have maybe 2 or 3, 4, 5, somewhere around in there. And you can invest your time and your effort to get those couple of them to really where they need to be functioning adults. Whereas if you had 50 of them, you really couldn't invest your time and your money and your resources unless you were a billionaire to successfully bring those children into the healthy adult world. Now, animals are not really, they're kind of more influenced by nature. So animals have 1 or 2 babies, and that's what they can support. They can't have more because they have to support themselves as well. If mom starves to death, the babies are definitely going to starve. So mom has to take care of herself as well as the babies in nature. So things like elephants, they live to be 80, 90, 100 years old sometimes, but they have 5, 6 babies, 7 babies throughout their entire lifespan. And it takes a really long time and a lot of effort to raise those babies to adulthood. So their populations really aren't going to be growing that fast. They're going to be pretty stable over time. They're going to make it to a certain point in time, basically where there's not a lot of death up until basically they reach the end of their lifespan. So humans really don't die anymore up until 70, 80, 90, and 60, somewhere around in there. Devoid of accidents or something like that, or something tragic, or prior to that. And elephants are kind of the same way. Orcas, whales, and things like that. Most of them make it to adulthood, and they die at their terminal age. Whereas something called a type 2 organism, which is the vast majority of animals on the planet, they kind of sort of invest a little bit of time in their babies. They raise them basically to the point where the baby's not going to die if you kick it out of the nest, or it leaves the mom or whatever, and that's basically what happens. So you're kind of basically up to chance every single day. If you're going to survive, if you're going to get hit by a car, if you're going to get eaten, if you're going to find enough food, is basically determined every single day you wake up. So if whereas our type 1, if you don't find enough food, mom's definitely going to take care of you. And sometimes to the expense of mom's death. That's unlikely in nature with animals, but it does happen sometimes. Whereas in birds and most rats and mammals and things like that, if the baby doesn't eat enough food, mom doesn't really care, and she's going to go eat enough food for her. And if the baby leaves the nest, mom's not going to come back and take care of it anymore. Whereas in nature, that's going to happen type 1, that's going to happen for quite a long time. So in birds and most mammals, they have a little bit of parental care, and after that, it's basically up to the roll the dice every single day. So you have a 50% chance of surviving every single day. So there's kind of an equal downhill curve of how long those organisms live. 50% chance of making it every single day. So that's kind of how that works. And then you have something called type 3, also called the boom or bust species. And these guys basically have billions of babies at once. They have no parental investment. They basically lay their eggs and leave. And the vast majority of those babies are going to die, and maybe 4 or 5 of them will make it to adults. So the trade-off of that is I don't have to put any effort into raising you, but the cost of that is billions of you are going to die. And some of you will make it to adulthood. It's the game of numbers. And that's kind of how that works. So, do you want to pay a lot to have successful work, or do you want to have really, cheap work that doesn't cost you anything and it's going to have billions of them, and a couple of them will make it? So, it kind of just depends on how you want to view it. And animals that don't live very long, little short-lived critters like flies and fish that may, live 4, 5, 10 years at the most, something like that. It's kind of how they reproduce. They just have lots of babies. Flies live, a couple of weeks. They have billions of eggs. They can't afford to spend a week or two of their lifespan raising those babies from little or protecting the eggs to the larvae and things like that. Because if they do, they're not going to be able to reproduce at all because they're going to die. So it's kind of how that works. So a lot of that stuff makes sense if you think about it. So life histories of organisms basically influence kind of what type of species they are and how they do what they do reproductive wise for babies. And that's basically influenced by natural selection. So if what worked really well to raise your babies worked well for you, you're probably going to do something similar to that from an evolutionary perspective. Because it was successful, evolution's going to repeat it. Whereas if it wasn't, something else is going to occur and something different is going to change. So little organisms that live 2 or 3 weeks, like I said, they're not going to be selected to raise babies into adulthood and invest billions of hours into them, simply because if they did, they'd die before they could reproduce in the first place. Whereas something that, like a bear that lives 20 years or 30 years, can afford to invest 2 or 3 years into a baby because they've got a little extra time. And if they don't, their babies are going to die without their help. So a lot of that stuff's just kind of influenced by natural selection and evolution and overall kind of how the organism's life is put together, kind of things like that. So the basic point overall is to just have a baby and get that baby to from larval or egg stage, if you like, if you're a mammal or whatever, seed, to successful breeding adult. Because if you have a baby that doesn't make it to adulthood, that can't reproduce, it's not really useful, if you like, for evolution. So they really want to get their babies to adulthood, and that's kind of what the point of it. If your baby can't fend for itself until it's adult, you have to fend for the baby, or else the entire point of you going through the effort of having that baby in the first place is pointless. So it's basically what they do. So since reproduction is super expensive, they really want to make sure that it's successful. It's going to cost a lot to have a baby. You got to go find a mate. You gotta have your body be able to support a baby. You have to grow the baby. Then you have to feed the baby. You got to protect the baby. So all of that stuff, and you're going to lose time defending that baby and feeding that baby for gathering your own resources. So all of that stuff is very costly. So is it worth the trade-off for you to have successful babies, or do you just want to have a billion of them and not worse? Most of them will die, but some of them will make it, kind of the odd numbers game. So really just depends on the animal itself, the organism that you're talking about, and how they evolved and things like that. So those two trade-offs, like I mentioned, type 1, type 2, type 3, they can also be broken down into something called the opportunistic or the equilibrium life history. The equilibrium life history is something like us, whereas an organism, we have long lifespan. We tend to invest a lot of time into our babies to make sure that our babies are very successful copies of us, basically. We want our babies to be quality, reproductively successful, societally successful, well-adjusted humans. And animals are no different. Elephants, they want their babies to be able to talk to other elephants, to know the social structures, to be able to navigate the elephant populations and the elephant interactions, because if they don't, they get shunned or they get killed. Great apes are the exact same way. They kill each other if they don't know how to speak each other's population's language and things like that. They fight and stuff like that. So the babies have to be taught how to navigate that, and that takes a really long time. So you want to invest some good time, some good effort to make sure that your baby can successfully reproduce, to pass on your genes, basically, is what the whole point of that is. You want to be selfish. Now, that's not conscious, but it's the evolutionary drive is to pass on your genes, basically. Long-lived, very few offspring, but our offspring almost always make it to adulthood to become successfully reproductive members of society or whatever, of a population, and it takes a lot of effort on our part to get them there. Whereas the other hand, an opportunistic life history, these guys are the boomer bust, if you like. They have billions of babies at once. They reproduce all the time, and they basically don't care. They have millions of babies. They leave. They go have millions more babies, and if the first nest gets destroyed by the first clutch of eggs or whatever gets destroyed by a predator or a fire or whatever, they're never going to know about it. They're never going to see those babies again in their lives, and they've got another one a minute later. And if those get destroyed, who cares? They got another million of eggs over here, and then that one's probably going to survive, but most of those will die. But a couple of them will make it to adulthood. It's the numbers game. You have a billion babies, 2 or 3 of them make it to adulthood to reproduce, and they have 2 or 3 billion, and basically that's how that works. These things become reproductively active very early in life because they don't live very long, so you want to get everything out of the way real fast. They don't live to a very long age. They tend to die very quickly after they reproduce because their whole point is to just make copies of themselves because they live so quickly. It's the quantity over quality. These guys don't have very strong babies all the time. Their babies aren't always going to make it to adulthood. They have billions of weak ones that get picked off, but the strong ones will survive. But they don't have strong babies. They just basically have lots of babies that are going to die, but a couple of them will make it. So that's an opportunistic life history. Most species are basically somewhere in the middle. We are an exception. Elephants are kind of an exception. Most animals fit that type 2 somewhere in the middle. They may have a little bit of parental investment at the beginning of their lifespan, and then after a certain time, the mother needs to get on with her, so she'll kick the babies out, maybe a little bit early, if depending from our point of view, if you like. So the baby has to go fend for itself, so the mother can get on by having more babies, basically, is what the idea is. So a lot of animals kind of fall somewhere in the middle, which is basically that type 2 reproductive curve. You get some parental care to get you kind of over the hump of being a baby, and then they kick you out. Whereas things like elephants, they can go to their mothers, or us, we can go to our parents at any point in time usually, and they'll help us out if they can. So population growth, ecologists can look at this in 2 different ways. And this is basically influenced once again by how the age structure of a population looks like. If you've got a lot of young, a lot of old, or just kind of an equal amount of everything kind of stuff. So if you have a lot of young, not a lot of old, your population is going to look like the one on the bottom there. So you can see down there they have a lot of young males, a lot of young females, not a lot of old population, and those are going to be reproductively active very quickly, making a lot of copies of themselves, which is going to cause that population to grow very quickly. The young are going to be using up the available resources to make more babies, which are going to make more babies, which are going to make more babies, which is going to cause the population to grow like crazy. Now, what will happen over time, or has already happened in some cases, is the population will eventually start to run out of resources, which is going to cause the birth rate to start to slow, which causes the population to kind of more stabilize out a little bit, where eventually the birth rate and death rate are going to start to equal. And you'll see that kind of on the top up there. It looks more like kind of like one of the little Russian temples, the tops of one of their churches, kind of the little onion domes. Where you see the population start to, stabilize a little bit, where the older or the younger are living a little longer. The ones that were reproducing really fast, they've lived to a certain age, they're not reproducing anymore. There were enough resources. They built a life, a society, if you like, or whatever for themselves. They've got available resources to keep themselves alive, but they're not reproducing. And since the younger ones below them are having to compete for those less and less resources that the older generations are taking out, they're not going to be quite as successful to make babies for themselves. So the populations aren't going to grow quite as quickly. Now, what's going to happen after a couple of generations over time is the population is going to start to shift, where you'll see a large growth at the top and not a lot at the bottom. And that's going to cause the population to decline when the older population is taking out lots of resources and not a lot at the bottom. And that's going to cause it to decline. So exponential growth occurs when populations grow very quickly. A lot of young, not a lot of old, grows very, very quickly. What happens is eventually you're going to reach a certain point where you can't continuously do that anymore. And that's going to be a more slow logistical growth kind of thing, very slow over time kind of growth. So exponential growth occurs when you have unlimited resources. So if there's no limit to basically what can occur, there's millions of resources, millions of space. This happens in petri dishes, bacteria, little tiny critters that live in the water and things like that. Us, in our case, where we just have limitless resources, our populations just grow and grow and grow and grow and grow like crazy. They double, they double, they double, they double. And eventually what's going to happen is our population is going to reach a point where we're going to hit something called the carrying capacity. And the carrying capacity occurs when there's so many organisms that they start to fight a little bit. And the analogy I like to use from this one is kind of an apartment building where there's 100 rooms and one person can live in each room, and that's how that works. That's the rules of the apartment building. Everybody has what they need: one refrigerator, everything they need, one bathroom, bedroom, blah, 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 studio apartments. Everybody's happy. That's basically what happens during exponential growth. There's enough apartment buildings, the population starts to grow from 1 to 2 to 3, and then eventually the apartments get filled up. And that's what happens when you reach the carrying capacity. There's no more room for anybody else. There's no more space in the pasture. There's no more coral reef to grow on, or whatever happens in the environment. Eventually what happens is you reach that carrying capacity. There's no more space, no more apartment rooms. So somebody is going to have to share apartment 1 with the person that lived there to start with. Now what's going to happen is the person in apartment 1 is going to have to now be unhappy. They're going to have to start sharing their resources. I get half the shower time. I'm going to have to share half my bed, or you're going to have to sleep on the floor, which means no one's going to be happy. So when that occurs, populations start to come into conflict. They start losing resources. The resources that I would be using are now going to be split or broken up unequally, which means I get more and you get less, which still means I get less because I'm having to share it with you and you're not getting enough to live. So nothing works when that starts to occur. And the more people that live in those apartments, somebody's in apartment 10 now, somebody's in apartment 20 now, so apartment 30 now, off apartment 40, all the way up. The more people you move in, the worse that scenario gets. Because what happened is we only had enough trash pickup people to service 100 people, and now we have 150 people living there. We have 200 people living there. The apartments didn't get any bigger. The services didn't change. The pipes didn't change to get rid of sewage or waste, or the septic system. It's built for 100 people. Now it's got 200, 300, 400 people living in it. And that's going to have massive repercussions. Eventually what's going to happen is the population will reach critical max, where it tips. One more person added into it and the entire thing falls apart. All the garbage is going to eventually overwhelm. The sewage is going to back up. The entire waste system is going to fall apart, and the entire population will collapse. And that's what happens when exponential growth occurs for too long. And this basically only occurs when things like algal blooms occur. You sort of red tide, petri dishes. You can do this a lot in the lab. It happens a lot in infections when people get sick. Really cool, but really strange occurrences of exponential growth in nature. Now, logistical growth tends to be the more common occurrence, where it's just a very slow, gradual growth over time, and then eventually you reach the carrying capacity, where birth kind of equals death, and it slows down as it reaches the carrying capacity and stuff like that. More slow, kind of gradual habitat, indefinite kind of perpetuation of the society, where we're not trying to overwhelm and deplete the entire resources. So this type of growth occurs, it kind of reaches the critical max, the carrying capacity, and it never really goes over that critical max threshold. We don't want the population to collapse. So eventually it will continuously, it'll kind of dip up and down a little bit, but it regulates itself a lot better. Now this kind of growth eventually will come to a crashing halt. But if you continuously feed it, it can continue to grow. And that's kind of how the world works, because we have a sun which continuously feeds us with energy. We're not a closed system from the environment. We have more energy coming in, but we don't have more resources on the globe. We have more energy from the sun to make more food for nature, but not necessarily more minerals. So that's kind of a big deal, something to be concerned with. So population growth goes in cycles. This makes perfect sense if you think about it. It's not always one or the other. It can be both, or it can be one at one time, or one or the other at this time, or whatever. It just changes back and forth. And this has to do a lot with predator-prey relationships or habitat relationships. Environments that flood pretty regularly will have a lot of animals come to that particular area, and if something rests dormant in the soil, plants will grow and things like that at that particular time, which means the populations explode, exponential growth, and then there's a 40-year drought, they're all gone, and then boom, 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 gone like that. So anyway, predator-prey relationships can occur. If the predator population goes really high, the prey will go really low, and then the predators will decline and die, and then the population of prey will go really high again, and then predators, and it goes back and forth all day long. It really just goes in cycles, depending on the species, depending on the environment, depending on the condition. Ecology is fun. So lots of different things can influence population size, and lots of different things can influence how big populations can get in the first place. Like some things are called limiting factors. Some of them depend on living conditions, and some of them don't. The ones that depend on living conditions living things are going to be density dependent. The ones that don't are going to be density independent. So a density dependent limiting resource or limiting factor. This depends on how many organisms there are in a particular environment. If there's 1 million elk in Glacier National Park, the chances of you being eaten by a wolf are pretty slim. There's a 999 million other of them to be eaten and not you. But if there's a disease that comes through, that's going to be, a not great thing. You have a high likelihood of you getting sick because there's just so many of you around. So if there's not a lot of resources in that particular area, competition is going to be really high if there's a bunch of you. So that's what a density dependent limit is. It's something that depends on how many animals there are. If there's more animals, those things are going to be worse. If there's less animals, it's not going to be so bad. If you got a little bit of resources, a lot of resources, and there's 4 of you, that's awesome. But the chances of you getting eaten by that wolf are now 1 in 4, so not so awesome. So kind of the trade-off of how that works. So that's a density dependent limit, something that depends on how many animals are there. Now, a density independent limit is something that doesn't, like a wildfire. A wildfire comes through and burns the entire place. If there's 1 million deer there or 4 deer there, their entire habitat's destroyed either way. It's going to wreck their entire habitat. If there were 4 trees there or 4 million trees there, they're all dead. It does not matter. If there were 5 reptiles there, or 15 reptiles there, or 5,000 reptiles there, they all got burned up in the fire. It does not matter. And natural disasters, hurricanes, volcanic eruptions, things like that, habitat destruction, where we go in and just destroy the place. Once again, if there's 5 trees there or 50,000 trees, we're going to destroy the whole place. If there was, an industrial accident like Chernobyl or contaminates the whole area, things that if there's 1 wolf there or 50 wolves there, they're all radioactive now. So it really doesn't matter what the populations of animals, the numbers of them are like in that area. It just matters what happens. So that's a density independent limiting factor. So the technical terms are biotic and abiotic. So density dependent would be something that looks at the biotic factors, living things, whereas an abiotic would be something that's non-living, like a wildfire or an industrial accident or something like that. Lightning strike that causes the fire or something like that. So humans are kind of weird. We're going up our exponential curve, but eventually it will slow down. We're going to look at the human population growth curve. This is technically it. And this is what happens when countries lift themselves out of poverty. The human growth curve or human growth population charts vary wildly per country. And that really just depends on how wealthy your countries are. If you have a very, underdeveloped country, you probably don't have a very good health care, which means you're going to have a lot of babies being born at home without a lot of prenatal care at all. Not a lot of postnatal care, if any. So that's basically what's going to lead to a very high death rate of juveniles. And then once they reach that high death rate, they're not going to have a very high growth population per se. Now, as the populations in the countries or whatever progress, they get a little better, things get better money-wise, medical-wise, stuff like that. The populations tend to drop that death rate really high from babies to really low, and now their populations can grow. And that's basically how populations of humans grow and are influenced by the economic statuses of the countries that they live in, of the governments and things that they live in. So as society progresses, you can see this trend tend to occur over time throughout not just history, like from a pre-Stone Age to Stone Age through the Romans and things like that. Watching the societies and things like that pull themselves from the low survival rate for infants up through medical advances and things like that. You can watch that occur not throughout just history, but out through economics and things like that, through countries overall. It really just depends on what country you live in and where your growth rates are and where your status is in the world economic-wise and things like that. So these are the growth charts that I talked about earlier. You got the one that looks kind of more like this. And then you got the oval at the top that's more stable. And then you've got the one that's really like this, that a lot of young folks that grows really quick. So these are the different countries throughout the world, just a representation of what the age structures look like in those particular countries. In India, they have a very high population of young people, which means India is going to be continuously growing their population throughout time, whereas here we tend to have a very stable population, very equal population, which means our population is not going to be expanding very much. I'm going to stay pretty much about the same. Whereas in China, over time, they have a very high elderly population, not a very high young population, which means their population is going to decline over time, see a declining trend. And that's age structures and how age structures influence population growth as well. And a lot of these things can be tied into economic sanctions, wars, histories, things like that, not just government structures and stuff like that, or the people that are there themselves. So death rates influence human population growth, and that makes sense if you think about it. Living in a population of a more economically stable country is not always the best thing for your health. It comes with a trade-off for junk food, and which comes with sugars and stuff like that, which comes with all kinds of fun diseases and stuff like that are influenced just with bad diets and lower quality foods and things like that. And the same can be said with living in a very poor country, and that happens as well too, because those people can't really afford very high quality food, so they tend to buy junk foods and things like that. So really just depends on how that works. It's very odd. So the diseases that come along with that. Also, if you live in a very industrial country that's not quite to the point where they're using clean energy yet, or they have a lot of factories and something in town that's burning coal, those people are going to be coming up with more lung infections and things like that at younger ages, which changes the age structure. So lots of fun different things come into play when you're talking about governments and quality of life in countries and economics across the world, influencing the human population growth and death rates and things like that. So basically, for once we overexploit all the resources on the planet, we cannot continue our current growth rate, if you like, at the way that we're doing it. We take more than we put back, basically, or than we recycle. So we really can't afford to do this. Now, you can see down here a graph of the richest versus the poorest countries on the planet, and they're proportionalized based on in the lower one, based on the amount of resources that they actually use per size of the country. So you can see Japan's quite small, but they use quite a lot of resources because they're an island. They can't produce any resources for themselves. Everything they have has to be brought in. Whereas the United States, we use about the same as we put out, but a bit more than we put out. But it's not huge as compared to something like Japan, where it's drastically different. Whereas some poorer countries, you guys can see those, the smaller countries, tend to use less resources than they put out because they tend to be exploited a lot for the resources that are there, unfortunately. So this is kind of something that needs to be addressed. We either need to produce or use less, one of the two, or recycle a little better. All of those would be wonderful, but kind of how that works. So basically, that's the human growth chain in a nutshell. This is also population trends in a nutshell. You can apply these to any species on the planet. Populations are cool. Animals are neat. Lots of things influence them more than just the environment around them. So as we continue this lecture series, we'll see a couple of the other things that influence the animals, and how the populations of those particular species grow and change over time. So if you have any questions on this, please let me know. Send me an email or whatever. I'll be happy to help you. If not, have a good rest of the day.